Chapter 14, Lesson 3, Heading Towards War. Now things are really picking up in the decline towards the Civil War. And a lot of this goes back to that Missouri Compromise, where if you look here, this line here, Missouri could be a slave state, and this line here denoted everything above it was going to be free of that Missouri or the Louisiana territory that had been taken over. And that was a compromise that was reached in 1820, and it seemed pretty clear Arkansas could become slave, Oklahoma eventually, if they voted on it. That was kind of the idea. But at that point, they didn't have this territory, so that was not under consideration all that much. So, in 1850, there were 15 slave and 15 free states, and so there's an even balance. Couldn't outvote each other in the Senate in particular. Each new slave state came in, when each new state came in, there was a balance between slave and free states. But when California comes in, then that's a problem, because it's going to be a big state to start with. So there's something called the Compromise of 1850. And this is Henry Clay, yes, the senator from Kentucky. Henry Clay came up with an idea, and he was one of the better guys at compromising in the government. So he had owned slaves, but he believed in the Union. And under the law, New Mexico and Utah could decide if they wanted slavery. California came as a free state. Something called the Fugitive Slave Law got put into place, and that we're going to come back to in a minute. And the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. Now, if you look here, that Missouri Compromise line was there. New Mexico, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe that could become slave, but that Utah territory, that pretty clearly is above the Missouri Compromise. And lots of people did not like this law, and just about everybody didn't like some part of it. The abolitionists in particular really against the Fugitive Slave Act, because it allows people from the South, slave catchers, to come up to the North and try and bring slaves back to the South. So really the only way you'd be safe is if you made it up to Canada, if you were an escaped slave. And it was something where the government had to help them capture the slaves if they were actually escaped slaves, and so that was really offensive to abolitionists in particular. So in 1854, again, this is another issue. 1854, they passed a law saying that Kansas and Nebraska would be allowed to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. If we go back for a second here, Kansas and Nebraska, this territory here, in this area here, would be allowed to decide if they wanted slavery, and this was this idea of popular sovereignty. Now they're above the Missouri Compromise line, so they shouldn't have been able to, according to the Missouri Compromise. Nebraska was pretty far north. There wasn't as likelihood of the need of slavery, but Kansas, there was a lot of problems. Basically, it was right next to Missouri, and it bordered on Missouri. So actually, what ended up happening was slavery supporters moved in when they voted on whether it was going to have slavery, and it was a very complicated thing, but they outvoted. They said that yes, they're going to have slavery, and then that constitution for the state got tossed out, and people wanted freedom, a free state as well. They came in, and violence erupted. Hundreds died, and this led to the nickname Bleeding Kansas. So there's out and out fighting, almost a pre-Civil War thing going on. And a new political party starts, and that's the Republican Party. And it's not like Democratic Republicans. Their main issue is being against the expansion of slavery in the territory. And I include this just as a way of showing how racist in terms of the politics was back then, this idea of the Democratic platform for the white man and the Republican platform. Look at the caricature, the way that it was made to look, and it just horribly stereotyped and racist in terms of the way it was. So, but against the expansion of slavery into these territories was the main issue. Dred Scott was an interesting guy. He was a slave who had been brought and lived in a free territory, and he went to court saying, "Hey, I've been living in a free territory, so therefore I should be free." The Supreme Court refused to recognize his right to sue. They didn't rule on his case as much as they just said, you know what, you don't even have a right to bring a case. And now the argument was slave owners, hey, slave owners could take their slaves wherever they wanted. And the court actually ruled, the Supreme Court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it would be taking people's property away, and they had property they termed as slaves if they moved into an area that didn't allow slavery. So yeah, lots of controversy, huge court case. Some government leaders said the Dred Scott case should be ignored. Others said it had to be obeyed. Again, lots of political fighting here. So then this guy named John Brown comes along, and this is in, I believe, 1859. He comes up with this idea that all we need to do is we need to arm the slaves. And he'd actually been in Bleeding, Kansas, and had hacked to death a few people with swords with his family. So he was a religious zealot, and he truly believed that he was put on this earth to end the evil of slavery, and had a religious idea that this is what he was going to do. And he took over an armory in Virginia, and he was planning on giving the weapons to the slaves. But he got tried, and it went really badly. He got tried and caught, and he was hung. He was put to death. But this just went ahead and reinforced this idea that the North is trying to get rid of the slavery for the South. And in the South, people really hated him. In the North, people started thinking maybe he's got kind of a point on some level for some of them. Now, Abraham Lincoln, he was one of the more interesting politicians in American history. Started off poor. He eventually ended up becoming a lawyer. Was a member of the House of Representatives for a while. Then he resigned. Was a lawyer who spoke out against the expansion of slavery. And then he ran against this guy named Stephen Douglas, who was this very popular politician. He was actually very short compared to Lincoln. He was nicknamed the Little Giant. But he ran against Stephen Douglas, and he was a Republican, and Douglas was a Democrat. And they had this series of 7 debates all over Illinois. And these were nationally broadcast on some level through the newspapers. And the way the debates worked were one guy started off with 60 minutes to talk, then the second guy had 90 minutes to talk, then the first guy had 30 minutes to talk again. So big, long debates. Douglas argued for what was called popular sovereignty, this idea that the people within a state should be able to decide whether or not slavery is allowed there. Lincoln eventually ended up winning more popular votes, but Douglas won the election. That raised Lincoln's national profile. Now in 1860, there was an election between 4 candidates, and the 4 candidates, Lincoln was the only one who was clearly against the expansion of slavery. And if Lincoln was elected, then southern states worried that, hey, our right to own slaves would be lessened, and new territories would not be allowed in new states would not be allowed in that had slaves. So it would lessen their amount of slave states over time in relation to the free states. Some states led by South Carolina actually talked about seceding if Lincoln was elected. Well, this is the way it worked. Lincoln won basically all the northern states. This Constitutional Union Party kind of put aside the idea of slavery. Douglas was running against Lincoln, and this is this area here, again, kind of with the idea of popular sovereignty. And the Southern Democratic Party, they were fine with the expansion of slavery. But Lincoln ends up winning, not by the popular vote, but definitely by the electoral vote, because there are more people in the North. And with that, with Lincoln's election, South Carolina secedes, and others secede too. They wanted to form a new nation called the Confederate States of America, and called the Confederacy, and they were led by this guy Jefferson Davis. And the conflict just keeps becoming more and more about slavery and becomes more and more violent. In the South, people argued that states should be able to determine things, and this was called states' rights against the national government. And when the states started to secede, Lincoln said it was illegal and that they did not have that right. And this kind of set it up for eventually the fighting to start.